staring towards $30 trillion. $30 trillion is hard to imagine. So think about it this way. That's more than $233,000 in debt for every American family. On July 31st, the suspension on the federal debt limit expired, and now Democrats in Congress, who continue to pursue a purely partisan, reckless tax and spending spree, are pushing this as a decision point with only two options: vote to suspend the debt limit or increase it, with no reforms to control excess federal spending. They want us to write the government a blank check to spend more money that we don't have. Republicans have been clear: we will not do it. Now, my Democrat colleagues will say that the debt ceiling shouldn't be a partisan issue, and I completely agree. But what we've seen from the Democrats this year has been purely partisan, even by Washington's broken standards. First, they passed a nearly $2 trillion so-called COVID bill that spent less than 10% of its funding on actually fighting COVID without any Republican votes. And now they are pushing forward a $5.5 trillion reckless tax and spending spree, again without a single Republican vote. This insane Democrat spending means we're on a dangerous path of reaching $45 trillion in federal debt by 2031. That's not my number. That's what the Democrats' own bill says. The Democrats' own projections have their reckless spending taking the U.S. debt to $45 trillion in the next 10 years. There are major consequences to this financial irresponsibility. Like any borrower, the federal government pays interest on its debt. When you rack up nearly $30 trillion in debt, that means hundreds of billions of dollars in interest. Who pays for it? The taxpayers. Right now, even with interest rates at historic lows, the U.S. government is already spending nearly $345 billion yearly on interest. Instead of funding important infrastructures in infrastructure, defense, or the environment, nearly $345 billion in hard-earned tax dollars are just paying interest, which provides zero return to American families. Just imagine how much that will grow to when the U.S. reaches $45 trillion in debt. And when interest rates return to normal levels, things will get even worse. Let's look at this. Right now, about 11% of what we're going to collect this year will go to pay the interest. There's no return for taxpayers on this interest. But let's look at what's going to happen by 2031. And this is the Democrats' budget. 23% of total federal receipts will go towards paying the interest. Now, that's assuming that interest rates stay low. Why would we believe that interest rates are going to stay low? Let's just look at, we're having unbelievable inflation right now. When inflation goes up, interest rates typically follow. Assuming low interest rates like the Democrats do, we could be spending over $1 trillion on just interest by 2031. Imagine if interest rates return to historical averages, our payments will be astronomical. The federal government brings in less than $4 trillion in revenues, so we'll be spending roughly a quarter of all tax revenue on interest that is nothing for taxpayers. How can Congress justify that? It's clear. Democrat spending has caused this massive Democrat debt. And it's time for liberals in Washington to own the debt crisis they have created. Republicans have been clear. We won't stand for it. We won't vote to bail out Democrats' out-of-control spending. We won't cut radical liberals in Congress more blank checks to bury our country in more debt, drive up America's interest expense, and fuel an already raging inflation crisis, hurting families across my state and across this country. Just last week, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the Consumer Price Index was up 5.3% in 1 year, from August to August, 5.3%. Year-over-year comparisons show that inflation has gone up each month of Biden's presidency. Government doesn't feel the bite of inflation, but everyday Americans do. I'm hearing from families all across my state. A father of 3 in Jacksonville, a mother of 4 in Machula, small businesses in Miami. Another family in Kissimmee told us about how hard it is to keep food on the table because everything is getting so expensive. They're having trouble keeping their car because of the cost of maintenance and gas. Of course, without a car, they won't have a way to get to work and provide for their family. It's heartbreaking to hear these stories. I can relate to this. I grew up in a poor family. My mom would take in ironing for extra money. She would give us exact change to go to the grocery store, and if the price of something went up, we just simply couldn't get it. In the face of this hardship felt by so many families in Florida and across this great nation, President Biden and Democrats here in Congress have zero interest in reducing the national debt and cutting their insane spending. Democrats have shown a heartless disregard for the struggles so many families in Florida and across America are dealing with right now. It's time we bring accountability to federal spending. Unlike our Democrat colleagues, Republicans have a solution-focused approach to fixing America's debt crisis. We know that the federal government can and must pursue practical measures that make it easy and relatively painless to cut spending. We can start that right now. Earlier this year, I introduced the Federal Debt Emergency Control Act, which prevents Washington from mindlessly spending by requiring that 2/3 of the Senate vote to increase the debt before approving any bill with deficit spending, terminating any unobligated funding from the stimulus bills, sending it back to the Treasury General Fund for deficit reduction, and fast-tracking any bill reducing the debt by at least 5% over 10 years. And today, I am joining my friend, Senator Pat Toomey, to reintroduce the Full Faith and Credit Act. This bill ensures that the U.S. government does not default on its debt while also prioritizing certain payments to our seniors, military, and veterans. It's common sense policy like this that will move the U.S. forward and out of the massive debt crisis we're clearly already in. I welcome all fiscally responsible colleagues to join me to say we don't accept the status quo. We won't watch in silence as Democrats try to spend us into oblivion. We can get spending under control. While I was governor of Florida, we paid down 1/3 of state debt by living within our means, all while cutting taxes. We can do it here. We have to start acting responsibly, and the time to do that is now. Politicians in Washington want you to think this is so complicated. They want you to think that dysfunction is inevitable. That is a lie. It's a lie that a broken system and failed politicians up here have been telling you for decades, and it's time for that to end. Getting America back on track is simple. It starts with passing common sense reforms that rein in reckless spending, stop Congress from getting paid when it shuts down the government, and force Congress to stay in session until it passes a balanced budget. And we keep our nation on the right financial path by making sure Congress is constantly held accountable for spending of taxpayer money. It's taxpayer money, every dollar of it. It's time to stand up for those on fixed incomes and our poorest families whose income can't keep up with inflation. It's time to stand up for our grandkids whose futures are being mortgaged by out-of-control Washington spending. This isn't political, it's good government and it's common sense. The longer we ignore the debt problem, the worse it will become, not just for us, but for future generations. A debt crisis is here today. It will be American families that feel the effects of their government's lack of fiscal responsibility through inflation, higher costs, and rising taxes. That's not the America anyone wants. American families deserve better. Through smart legislation and responsible choices, we can be truly accountable to the American people and bring some stability back to the federal government's bank account. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Missouri.